On the 9th of October 2018, a man walked into a canteen on King George Island and put a knife into another man's chest. 14 people were living at that station. There was no police force on the continent to call. No court. No cell. Not one. In an area larger than Europe and the United States combined. The victim was still breathing. Someone had to decide what happens next. And the answer isn't nothing happens. It's much stranger than that. Because here's what we're going to find out. Antarctica is not lawless. There is a law that applies to you down there, and it is written down. It is very specific about who it covers. And it does not cover almost anybody who actually goes there. By the end of this, you'll understand why that gap exists, and why the people who could close it have very good reasons not to. The station was Bellingshausen, Russian, sitting on a rock off the Antarctic peninsula. The two men had been there more than 6 months. An engineer named Sergei Savitsky, 54. A welder named Oleg Beloguzov, 52. The official explanation for what happened between them was 4 words: tensions in a confined space. Beloguzov was flown to a hospital in Chile with a wound to his heart. He survived. And Savitsky did something that tells you everything about how justice works down there. He surrendered. To the station chief, not to an officer, to his boss. Because there was no officer. And that isn't an accident of geography. It's written into the treaty on purpose. You've probably heard that Antarctica is lawless. That version gets repeated constantly, and it's wrong in an interesting way. Antarctica is not a legal vacuum. It's something stranger. It's a place where the law that applies to you depends entirely on the passport in your pocket, and where the machinery that would normally enforce that law simply does not exist. No Antarctic criminal code, no Antarctic police, no court, no prison, no international tribunal with authority over the ice. Nothing was ever built. And to understand why nothing was built, you have to look at what the treaty was actually trying to avoid. The Antarctic Treaty came into force in 1961. It covers everything south of 60 degrees. Its central achievement was freezing 7 overlapping territorial claims in place. Nobody gives up a claim. Nobody presses one. Article 8 handles jurisdiction, and it says something very specific: designated observers, and scientists on official exchange programs, and the staff accompanying them, are subject only to the jurisdiction of the country whose nationals they are. So a French scientist who commits a crime at an Australian station answers to France, not to Australia, not to Antarctica. That sounds like a complete system. Now read the list again, slowly, because what's missing from it is almost everyone: observers, exchange scientists, accompanying staff. That's it. That's the whole list. It does not include the cooks, or the mechanics, the electricians, the plumbers, the heavy equipment operators, the pilots, the contractors, the doctors, the winter caretakers, or the tens of thousands of tourists who step onto the continent every year. For all of those people, the overwhelming majority of everyone who has ever set foot in Antarctica, the treaty does not assign jurisdiction at all. It acknowledges that nations hold differing positions on the question, and it instructs them to consult with each other and reach a mutually acceptable solution if a dispute comes up. That's the mechanism. Consultation. A polite conversation. After the fact. Sergei Savitsky was an engineer. Oleg Beloguzov was a welder. Neither was an observer or an exchange scientist. On paper, no country had a clear claim to either of them, so individual nations went and built their own answers. And the results are genuinely strange. The United States reaches Antarctica through a category called the Special Maritime and Territorial Jurisdiction. It covers crimes committed in any place outside the jurisdiction of any nation, by or against an American. Murder, arson, and a long list of others travel with the passport. There's also the Antarctic Conservation Act, which puts American Antarctic activity in front of federal district courts with willful violations carrying up to $10,000 and a year inside. South Africa went further and got weirdly specific. Under 2 separate acts, Antarctica is deemed to sit inside the jurisdiction of one particular magistrate's court, in Cape Town. So there is a single courtroom in Cape Town with jurisdiction over a continent. And here's the crack running through the whole patchwork. The United States doesn't recognize anyone else's Antarctic territorial claims, which means two countries can look at the same crime on the same ice and disagree about which country it happened in. But even when jurisdiction is clear, something else fails. Picture the crime scene. There are no forensic technicians on the continent, no evidence lockers, no chain of custody, no way to preserve a scene when the room is also the only warm room in the building. Nobody is dusting the canteen for prints. Nobody photographs anything to an evidentiary standard because nobody there is trained to. Then the distance. Savitsky's journey from Bellingshausen back to St. Petersburg took roughly 11 days. 11 days between the act and the first contact with anything resembling law enforcement. And then the witnesses, which is the subtle one. Your witnesses are 12 colleagues who've been sealed in together for months, who will keep living together after the investigation, and who all depend on the same employer for the flight home. That's not a neutral pool observers, that's a household. And there's one more problem nobody thinks about until it happens. You've got a violent man and no cell. So where does he sleep tonight? The next flight out is days away, possibly weeks depending on weather. At Bellingshausen, the answer, according to reports at the time, was the station's small Orthodox chapel, a wooden church built on the rock above the base. He was kept there for around 10 days. Sit with that for a second. The most serious violent incident in the recent history of the continent, and the holding facility was a chapel, watched over by the colleagues of the man he'd stabbed, because the alternative was letting him sleep in the same corridor as everyone else. That's not a legal system failing. That's the absence of one, improvising. And it points at what actually happens in almost every case. In practice, the system that governs Antarctica isn't criminal at all. It's administrative. You don't get arrested. You get removed. The station calls it in. You're taken off the ice on the next available flight, and you're quietly never offered a contract again. Reports of harassment, assault, and threats at Antarctic stations have surfaced repeatedly over the years, and the resolution is almost always the same shape. Someone goes home. There's an internal report. No charge is filed. Savitsky's the exception that proves the pattern. He was met by police at the airport, charged with attempted murder, and placed under house arrest. That happened not because Antarctica has a justice system, but because both men were Russian. One Russian court could take the case without any other country objecting, and the accused handed himself in and never contested it. Change one detail, make the victim Chilean and the accused a contractor for an American company. Now there is no court on earth with an uncontested claim, and nobody is in a hurry to fix that. Because to close the gap, the treaty nations would have to agree on whose law applies where. And you cannot answer that question without answering a second one. Whose territory is it? That is the exact question the treaty was written to avoid. 7 countries claim slices of Antarctica. Some of those slices overlap. The treaty works, genuinely works, for over 60 years on a continent with no army and no border, precisely because it never resolved them. So the jurisdictional hole isn't a drafting error somebody forgot to clean up. It's structural. It is the cost of the peace. Every year the gap stays open as another year nobody has to reopen the map, which leaves a real question, and I don't think it has an obvious answer. One view, fix it. Write a genuine Antarctic criminal framework with real investigators, real evidence handling, and a standing court. People are being hurt in a place where nobody can be held responsible. The other view, don't touch it. The moment you build a court, you have to say whose court it is, and that question could unfreeze territorial claims that have been safely dormant for 2 generations. A continent with unsolved assaults is bad. A continent with a border dispute is worse. So would you take the court and the risk, or keep the peace and the whole? Tell me below. I want the argument, not the agreement. Because right now, tonight, there are people asleep at a station on the ice with no police within 2,000 miles. And if one of them walks into a canteen with a knife, nobody there knows the answer either.